Good morning. I hope it's okay. I'd like to start with a Christmas story this morning. I know it's August. Some of you may have already had your first pumpkin spice latte. Some of you may have had several. You've been ready for that. I actually have a friend who works in a coffee store who said, "Please pray for me. Pumpkin spice latte season is here." And so this story is a little more serious than that, though. The year was 1914, and it's in the middle of the First World War. There was this belief that it would be over by December. But December came, and the fighting was still very intense at that time. But at this point, the Pope had actually sent a proclamation out that he desired peace, and he desired for the war to end. And so on December 7th, 1914, Pope Benedict had implored leaders of these battling nations to hold a Christmas truce. And he asked that the guns may fall silent, at least upon the night the angels sang. And this plea, it was officially ignored. Many of the battlefield commanders, they changed their strategy to only shoot when they saw enemies. And so it was at this time very quiet, but the war was still at play. And so it was on Christmas Eve of 1914, in the muddy trenches on the Western Front, British soldiers began to hear a sound coming from the other side. Across the field, among the dark shadows beyond, they could hear the murmur of voices. "Do you hear the Germans kicking up that racket over there?" Well, the Germans, they were actually singing Christmas carols together, as it was Christmas Eve. In the darkness, some of the British soldiers began to sing back. They could hear the tune of the songs they were singing. Suddenly, they heard a confused shouting from the other side, and so they all stopped to listen. The shouts, they came again, and the voice was an enemy soldier speaking in English with a strong German accent, and he was saying, "Come over here." Right, like they're going to do that, right? One of the British sergeants answered back, said, "You come halfway, I will come halfway." And what happened next would, in the years to come, stun the world and make history. Enemy soldiers began to climb nervously out of their trenches and to meet in the barbed wire-filled no man's land that separated the armies. Normally, the British and the Germans, they communicated across the no man's land with streaking bullets, with only occasional gentlemanly allowances to collect their dead unmolested. But now there were handshakes and words of kindness between enemies. The soldiers, they traded songs, tobacco, and wine. They joined in a spontaneous holiday party together in the cold night. And here they were, the actual practical soldiers of the German army. There was not a bit of hate on either side. And this wasn't confined to just that one battlefield. It was starting on Christmas Eve. There were small pockets everywhere of French, German, Belgian, and British troops that would hold impromptu ceasefires across the Western Front, with reports of some even on the Eastern Front as well. And some accounts suggest that a few of these unofficial truces remained in effect for several days. And for those who participated, it was surely a welcome break from all that they had been enduring together. When the war had just begun 6 months earlier, most soldiers figured that it would be over pretty quickly and that they'd be able to go home with their families in time for the holidays. Not only would this war drag on for 4 more years, it would prove to be one of the bloodiest conflicts ever up until that time. The Industrial Revolution had made it possible to mass produce new and devastating tools for killing. Among them, fleets of airplanes and guns that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. And bad news on both sides had left soldiers with plummeting morale. There was the devastating Russian defeat at Tannenberg in August of 1914. and the German losses in the Battle of the Marne a week later. By the time that winter had approached in 1914 and that chill set in, the Western Front stretched for hundreds of miles. Countless soldiers were living in misery in the trenches on the fronts, while tens of thousands had already died. Well, then Christmas came. Descriptions of the Christmas truce, they actually appear in very numerous diaries and letters of that time. One British soldier, a rifleman named J. Redding, wrote a letter home to his wife describing the experience that he had in one of those truces. He said, "My company happened to be in the firing line on Christmas Eve, and it was my turn to go into a ruined house and remain there until 6:30 on Christmas morning. During the early part of the morning, the Germans started singing and shouting, all in pretty good English. They shouted out, 'Are you the rifle brigade? Have you a spare bottle? If so, we will come halfway and you come the other half.' Later on in the day, they came towards us," Redding described, "and our chaps went out to meet them. I shook hands with some of them, and they gave us cigarettes and cigars. We did not fire that day, and everything was so quiet it seemed like a dream." There was another British soldier, one named John Ferguson, who recalled the truce this way. He said, "Here we were laughing and chatting to men whom only a few hours before we were trying to kill." One German infantryman described how a British soldier set up a makeshift barber shop, charging Germans only a few cigarettes each for a haircut. Other accounts describe vivid scenes of men helping enemy soldiers to collect their dead and help their wounded, of which there were plenty. One British fighter named Ernie Williams later described in an interview his recollection of some makeshift soccer play on what turned out to be an icy pitch. The ball appeared from somewhere. I don't know where. They made up some goals, and one fellow went in goal, and then it was just a general kickabout. I should think there were about a couple of hundred taking part. But it wasn't this way everywhere. Even though this word had spread about this impromptu truce, this ceasefire, some had used that opportunity to trick people into a neutral ground in order to kill them. Many of the highest in command didn't want fraternizing with the enemy, and though there's no record of anyone being court-martialed for this, there was some talk that some were disciplined for taking part in the truce. Eventually, this battle would resume, and the war would claim roughly 15 million lives. And it's with that story that I want us to think about this in our life. In our lives, we're not called to war. We're called to peace. And this is where Jesus is taking this great Sermon on the Mount next, as he tells us in his Beatitudes, and the one that we're going to read this morning in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. He says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." We know that conflict is around every single corner, and that peace is not an easy thing to bring about. We deal with that. We see it all the time in all the ways that war and struggle and strife come between people in our world today. You know, for Jesus to come out and to say this out loud to people at that time, he's asking a lot of them. Because peace is usually the thing that most people, nations and civilizations, people everywhere, they're longing for peace. But it still seems out of reach for everybody. What I want us to see this morning is that Jesus is not only calling for peace. You know, what Jesus is saying in this passage is not just, I just want you to keep the peace among you. Although that's true, we should be doing that, right? This is something that Paul will go on to say in his letters. Jesus says that the ones who are blessed are the people who are the peacemakers. People who actually seek to make peace. And I believe that we can see that there's a difference here between these things, between being a peacekeeper and a peacemaker. The word peacemaker, to me, it sounds like this is something that's active. When I read that word, I think of an active participation. That we're not just out in our world just being peaceful, leaving people alone, but we're actually out in the world seeking to make peace with those that are actually seeking to make war with us. But how do we accomplish something like this? It seems daunting, right? How do we, as the people of God, make peace? I want to take us to a passage that the Apostle Paul teaches in Romans chapter 12. He outlines a few ways in which it's possible for us as Christians to make peace. He's got some good principles here. And these are the things that I think every Christian has learned from Jesus within the Beatitudes and in his Sermon on the Mount. And I think Paul is just applying this here. So let's turn over to Romans chapter 12. We're going to read this passage and draw some conclusions from this. Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 14. Paul writes here to this church in Rome. He says it this way: "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." I hope when you read that passage, you're seeing the same things that I'm seeing this morning. You know, Paul says some pretty profound things in just this little section in this letter to Rome. He talks about being peacemakers here in this passage. So let's outline a few of these things together and look at this. You know, he says to bless those who persecute you. That's one of his foundational teachings from this passage here. The Apostle Paul, he's writing to the church in Rome, and he calls on the believers to bless the people persecuting them. And there's a lot of pressure there, especially as followers of Jesus in Rome, to remain pure to the teachings of Jesus. So in order to bless those who persecute you was asking a lot of those Christians. You know, they had this syncretism of adding the local customs and practices that were very rampant in that culture. And it would be difficult to ignore what was happening around them. And so many were giving in. They would stick their cultural practices on top of their faith and their Christianity. And they would kind of meld the two into two things and into one thing. And it would look really odd to be a Christian that way. But I see that in our world today. It's hard to live in this world and not be influenced by some kind of outside force. You know, just owning a cell phone right now, that alone exposes us to so much. It's hard to have a cell phone and not see what we call influencers, the influencers, right? What they share, what they post, what they buy, and what they support, and to not say, hey, that looks pretty nice, I want that too. You know, to not feel like an outcast. Many of our kids, and honestly many adults, are seeing this and adopting those lifestyles where they want to become influencers and show the cool things they like to share and buy and wear. Let me ask, did you know that the makers of some of these social media apps like Facebook and Snapchat and TikTok and Instagram, they hire experts and creators of casino and gambling machines to mimic the repetition that happens with those that addicts people to keep playing. And they hired them to do that for social media so that you'll just scroll one more time and scroll one more time and one more time, till it sucks you in. And you just keep scrolling, and eventually you'll see the sponsored ads, the influencers that are out there, and the content that's going on, and that way they make more money by doing that. At the same time, you kind of see the terrible things that people are doing. It's a little scary. There's actually a documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma. I actually recommend this film for people to see this. It's very revealing. I would encourage you to see this if you have Netflix. I don't know if it's anywhere else, but this is one I can actually feel like a clean conscience sharing this. Usually there's bad things in films and you don't want to share them. But back to the matter here, Paul encourages these people here in Rome, and he says, instead of just knocking down everything we see and hear and talking bad about it, not to argue with or to be at odds with our enemies and our persecutors. Instead, he says, seek to bless those people. How can you be a blessing to those people around you? This is actively looking for ways to bless people that you are at, quote-unquote, war with, to where you're no longer at war. I pray that we're not battling our neighbors and our enemies as though they are our enemy, because our war is not with flesh and blood, right? It's against the spiritual forces that are around us. But what does Paul say to do in order to bless them? In verse 20, he gives us some practical examples. He says, if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. And then in verse 21, he says, to overcome evil with good. What would this world look like if all of Jesus' followers did that? Think about your enemy right now. Who is your enemy? Who is that? Is it someone you know? Maybe a neighbor? Maybe it's just an acquaintance, somebody you see every now and then. Or maybe it's somebody you don't even know, but you're at odds with them because they live close to you. Maybe someone from the opposite political party as you. Uh-oh, I'm stepping on toes now, right? Maybe it's the state government. Maybe you view the president as the enemy, whether this one or the last one. What can you do to bless them? Paul says, go do this. So far as it depends on you, you should bless them. Are they in need of something? Help them. Give them food or a drink. But you overcome their evil, whether it's evil or not, but to you it is, right? Overcome their evil by doing good. It's difficult to imagine that someone would continue to do evil to you if you were blessing them and showing them the love of Jesus. Second, Paul says, associate with the lowly. In verse 16, Paul says to spend time with those who are less than you. Associate with the lowly, there in verse 16. Another way to put this is to give your life over to humble tasks. In our world, we're all trying to get a leg up on everyone else around us. Maybe it's this attitude that creates a lot of the animosity that we have with other people. But if we devote our time to the jobs and service that others really don't want, we're reaching out with the love of Jesus, and we're accomplishing this blessing for the lowly. And there are always people that are looking to be seen, be out front. I hate to keep mentioning social media, but I see all the time people that will share their good deeds as they're doing them. I couldn't imagine going out and doing something nice for someone while holding my cell phone up and recording it. But that's what's happening. And I see that all the time. Oh, maybe I'm scrolling too much, but I do. I see that a lot. There are people that want to be seen out front and known. They want to be known for their goodness and their good deeds. And so then taking on tasks that we don't necessarily like, being the guy that takes out the garbage, wipes tables down, stacks chairs, serves meals. If we do those types of things, we're not just blessing everyone else, but we're also setting an example of what it looks like to make peace. We're making peace with people in the world when we do good deeds, because people feel more at peace when things are accomplished. Paul also says to never be wise in our own sight. You know, as I read this, I said, is Paul saying not to have wisdom? No, he's alluding to people who just pretend to be humble, and then they act arrogant. They're constantly looking to share what knowledge they have. You know, this is not a lowly position, as Paul had said. You know, associate with lowliness. This is not lowliness. Paul is urging people to be truly humble, and that means you don't always have to be first to step in front of everyone to have the right answer. You know, wait for the right opportunity. It's hard, but the smartest person in the room is sometimes the most difficult person to endure, right? You probably all have that person in your mind. We are glad to have smart people in our lives. I am so appreciative of the wise among us. It is helpful to know when we need that wisdom. But the quote-unquote know-it-all, that person is usually seen as an arrogant person, not humble. We don't really want advice or information from people who act like that, even if they're right, even if they're correct. And so Paul says, associate with the lowly, because you'll find that when you are lowly, you're being like Jesus. Association with the lowly places you as lowly. And remember the Beatitude from about a month ago in chapter 5, verse 5. He said, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Be meek, be lowly, like Jesus, and associate with the lowly. Well, third, Paul goes on to say, never avenge yourself. Never. He's full of these absolutes, right? These imperatives. In verse 19, Paul says, never avenge yourselves. This is difficult in our culture, a culture that thrives on wanting and receiving justice whenever we're maligned. Whenever something goes wrong in our lives, we want justice. We want what's due to us, and we want it quickly as possible, right? Yet the Apostle Paul reminds us that vengeance isn't ours to make. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Paul's letter here, he's quoting Moses in Deuteronomy and reminding them, who is it that gets vengeance? Not us. It's God. So never avenge yourself. We have to leave these things to God. Leave them to God. They're His. When we're treated unfairly, we're told to leave it to Him, and that means we may never witness the outcome ourselves. We have to be okay with that. We have to give it to God and move forward in our lives and forget what happened. You know, I think of these three things, these imperatives that Paul gives, and I say, or I guess I ask, are these easy things for us to do? Blessing those who persecute us, associating with the lowly, never avenge yourselves. This is tough. This is a high calling from God, but they are things that we can achieve. Paul is telling the people of the church, you can do this. You can accomplish this. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. And if we live this way, what does Jesus say about this? Back to the Beatitude. He says, you shall be called sons of God. Jesus, the Son of God, tells the people that if they will be peacemakers, they too will be called sons of God. Live in such a way that you're being like Jesus to your enemies, and God will bless and honor you as one of His children. That's a promise. That's a promise. Back to Romans for a moment. If you go back to chapter 8, Paul says, the Spirit Himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with Him, in order that we may also be glorified with Him. Yeah, this is hard. As Paul experienced and as Jesus experienced suffering, we see that we will suffer with Him, but we will be glorified with Jesus. Peace is not an easy thing to bring about. As Jesus was preparing for what was coming, He told His disciples in John chapter 14, peace I leave you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. Jesus the Prince of Peace. He let us know that these things would be painful in the temporary, but in the eternal, it'll be a moment. It'll go by so quick and forgotten. And until then, Jesus leaves his peace. Not just the kind that the world typically gives, which, as I mentioned, is usually half-hearted. It's just tolerating other people for now. Grumbling, just an afterthought. This is not peacekeeping. This is peacemaking. Jesus' peace is made. It's intentional. Jesus was a peacemaker for those that needed to know what God was all about. And so I call us to that as well. May we all be peacemakers, not just peacekeepers, not just war avoiders, but let us make peace. I want to encourage you this morning to think about the areas of your life where you need to be making peace. And it might be things that you can't control. Those things you have to give up to God. But it might be something that you could have a say in. But maybe you choose to be silent sometimes and just make peace. Maybe it's a more active role in finding ways to bless the people who you would least likely want to spend time with. The lowly, your enemies, the people who are at war with you. I think about some of the things that I do see on social media. It's interesting. The Christian Chronicles had a couple of articles up. I won't go into what they're about, but I'll give you a hint. One side was angry because the Christian Chronicles seemed to be extolling the virtues of someone from the right politically. And the people in the comments were very angry that they would do that. This person's evil. Why would you say these things? Well, then they had another article just a little bit later, and they were kind of talking about a more progressive group of people. And those on the right were getting mad and writing in the comments really mean things about those people. And I just thought, man, our witness is not being shown in the way we respond to people who are different than us, people who disagree with us. I found the articles to be harmless. They were just reporting news. And yet you had people on the right attacking people on the left, and people on the left attacking people on the right, all of whom claim Christ. This is the Christian Chronicle. This wasn't MSNBC or Fox News. This was a Christian newspaper. And I wonder if we're not like that in our world a little bit too much, and that people, they miss out on us as Christians being peacemakers. I recently made some comments to some of my longtime acquaintances from college that we've allowed our political stances and our faith commitments to overstep our love for one another. And I chose in that moment to be a peacemaker and tell every single person, every one of them, that I loved them. And I miss them. I miss seeing you. I challenge you to think about that a little bit this week and try to do the same. Who are the people that you need to make peace with? Think of ways to be a peacemaker this week, and I encourage you to go and do that. We're going to sing some more, and then we'll take of our communion this morning. Think of how we can make peace and the ultimate peace that comes from Jesus, and why we're even able to be assembled like this in this room this morning. Let's sing. Let's continue singing.